Hey guys, welcome back. So let's go ahead and finish up Unit 4 with this last slide, last presentation, sorry. We left off talking about reservoirs. We talked about living and non-living reservoirs. And now we need to talk about the next step in an infection, which would be the portals of entry and portals of exit. In order for an infection to get in and cause disease, or for a pathogen to get in and cause disease um, in our body, it needs to get a portal of entry. It needs to find a way into the body. So the way that the organism's pathogens get into the body is the portal of entry. So an example of a portal of entry are eyes, ears, cuts, abrasion, your mouth. So if you're wondering why I've been telling you for the last 2 months not to touch your face, is because 3 of those big major portals of entry are on your face. So we don't want to introduce pathogens to the area of your face because it promotes the entry of a pathogen into the body. Now, pathogens have to get in the body to cause infection, and in order to be transmitted, they need to get out. So a portal of entry is how they get in, a portal of exit is how they get out. Again, viruses, pathogens can exit the body through various different ways, but examples are the ears, the eyes, the anus, the mouth, through blood, bodily fluids, semen, vaginal secretions, saliva even. These are all ways that a pathogen can get out of the body. So portals of entry, how they get in, and portals of exit, how they would escape or get out. Now, once they get into or get out of the body, they need to be transmitted. And transmission is a very important key to understanding how pathogens work. We have to understand how they're transmitted, how they're passed back and forth to people, so we can help, in this case, in the case of COVID, how we can limit the spread, which is why you're social distancing today, which is why you're watching this instead of being in the classroom. So the transmission of a disease occurs when a pathogen is spread from person to person or from a reservoir to a person, and it'll have to go through a portal of entry in order to cause infection in that person. So transmission is how the pathogen is passed to another organism. We've got 3 major means of transmission: contact, by vehicles, and by vectors. Okay, so here's our look at our modes of transmission: contact, vehicles, and vectors. Now, we wouldn't be good biologists if we kept them all in big, broad categories. We need to break them down into smaller and smaller categories. So on this slide, I've organized the different modes of transmission so you guys can see them all in one slide, know where they are, and know what categories they fall into. So the next few slides, we'll go over each one of these and make sure every one of these modes of transmission is clear for everybody. The first mode of transmission that we'll talk about is contact transmission. And contact transmission occurs when an infectious disease is transmitted from an infected individual to a new host. Now, there's several different ways that this can happen. The first one is by direct contact. Now, this will occur with body contact from a person who's infected to a person who isn't infected. We have horizontal direct transmission. This is the type of thing you'd see from people shaking hands, kissing, sexual contact. It's when we pass a pathogen from one person to another. Similar to that, we have vertical transmission. Now, vertical transmission is when we pass a pathogen from a parent to an offspring, either through the egg or the sperm, or through placenta, through breast milk, or through the birth canal. So vertical transmission goes from a parent down to a offspring. And examples of this could be herpes simplex virus 1 and 2. These can be passed during birth. The baby is exposed to this virus as it's traveling through the birth canal. So this is an example of vertical transmission from the mother to the baby during birth. And the third part of direct contact is the fecal oral route. And this is very common in places where we don't have good sanitation. And it can be quite common in places where we do have good sanitation. And this ultimately results from a pathogen moving um, from their hand to the mouth with poor hand washing techniques. So your hands are dirty. They've come into contact with a pathogen. You didn't wash your hands well, you touched your face, and then the pathogen gets into your mouth, and that causes disease again. Now, again, sticking with contact, we can have contact transmission through an indirect method. So this would be number 2 of our contact transmission. And this happens when you have contact with non-living objects. Now, these non-living objects will have the virus on them or the pathogen on them, and we call these things fomites. So a fomite could be something like a soiled tissue. So a friend of yours blew their nose, they left the tissue on the desk, you picked it up and put it in the garbage, and you get the cold from doing that. That's indirect contact transmission by way of a fomite, and the fomite was a soiled tissue. But almost anything can be a fomite. Gloves, dishes, doorknobs. Money is a absolutely horrible fomite. It can carry a lot of different pathogens because it's passed down to people, person to person. Lipstick, soap even, children's toys. A lot of times you see children's toys at a doctor's office. Might not necessarily be a good idea to let your children play with those because they could be, if they weren't properly cleaned, they're usually properly cleaned. But if they're not, then they would be a very good fomite. They would be a great source of indirect contact transmission. And the third type of contact transmission is a droplet transmission. And this is what we're seeing with COVID-19. It's commonly transmitted through droplet. And droplets are formed when people talk or they cough or they sneeze. And you can see on the picture down here is a picture of a young girl sneezing. You can see the pattern there where she produces all kinds of droplets. It's safe to say that those droplets will have virus in there, and it can be transmitted to somebody who comes in contact or breathes in those droplets. Another thing that can happen from this sneeze is all those droplets will fall onto a surface. So we have our droplet, and it's covered, it's got the virus in here, and it's full of mucus and water and saliva and stuff. After a while, that droplet will just become a little tiny pile of probably virus particles as the water and all that has evaporated off. So once we get to this stage, we call this a dried up droplet. We call it a droplet nuclei. So you may see droplet nuclei as you're reading through stuff about COVID, and this is all it means. Now, according to some research, so the COVID virus can land on the surface from a droplet, and it can live anywhere from 3 hours. I've read up to 3 hours, and I've also read up to 9 days. So you can see we're still learning about this. We're still not exactly sure everything about it. Okay, so the first type of transmission we talked about was contact. Now the second one we're talking about is vehicle. Now there are 3 vehicles for disease transmission, and those are water, air, and food. So a vehicle is a non-living carrier of a pathogen. So lucky for us right now, COVID doesn't seem to be carried by a vehicle. It doesn't seem to be carried in water like cholera would be, for example. It's not necessarily airborne. It doesn't float around in the air on dust particles and so forth like we would with influenza. And there's no research right now showing that it can be transmitted through food like you'd see salmonella or listeria or even some species of Clostridium. So a vehicle is a non-living carrier of a pathogen, and there's three: water, air, and food. Now, the last type of modes of transmission that we're going to talk about is the vector. Now, a vector is a living organism. So a vector is when a pathogen is transferred from a reservoir to a host, or from host to host, via a living organism. So the best example of a vector is obviously going to be the mosquito, the most dangerous animal on the planet. Mosquitoes carry a lot of different pathogens. One of the most significant ones is Plasmodium, which is a protist that causes the disease malaria. You can also have many more insects that are vectors. Fleas, for example, will carry a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, which causes the bubonic plague. Lice can cause mange, a disease that we commonly see in cats and dogs. Sandflies can carry a disease called trypopanomyces, which is commonly called African sleeping sickness, which is a disease you see mostly in Africa, but it's transmitted by sandflies. So these are all examples of living organisms that can carry pathogens from a reservoir to a new host. Therefore, they can spread that disease, and that's why it's a mode of transmission. Now, knowing the mode of transmission is really, really important, because that allows us to break the chain of infection, which will hopefully decrease the numbers of people who are infected. Now, in order to do that, we have what we call standard precautions. And if you guys start to work in clinics and stuff like that, first thing you'll learn about are standard precautions. These are things that environmental and healthcare workers do in order to prevent transmission of a disease, to protect the patient, to protect people, and to protect themselves. So it's a set of standard precautions that are used for all patient contact, and it's used to reduce the risk of transmission of pathogens. You won't always know if somebody is sick, what they have, what's causing their disease. So you take these general precautions to protect yourself and to protect your patient. Standard precautions would involve many things, but first and foremost is hand washing. Hand washing is super, super important when it comes to dealing with pathogens. There will also be precautions about personal protective equipment, PPE, when you should wear it, what type of PPE you should wear, depending on the type of infection you're dealing with. Standard ways of cleaning patient care and equipment, so beds, chairs, gurneys, bathrooms, floors, all of these things would come under a standard precaution. How you handle soiled linens or sharps, for example. So if you change somebody's bed, it's changed in a certain way. The laundry is washed at a certain temperature with a certain type of disinfectant. How you get rid of needles, sharps, razors, anything that could have come in contact with bodily fluids. They all have a standard set of procedures that you deal with in order to prevent infection from these things. And finally, we get patient placement. Depending on what or how the patient's infected with, you would put patients who are suffering from similar diseases in a similar place so that they don't spread it around, or they keep it isolated to one area. A good example of patient placement right now is asking people to self-isolate. All right, you're placing a patient away from healthy people in order to prevent the infection, and that's really, really important. There's two more modes of transmission that we don't commonly talk about, but they do happen, and sadly, it's a fact of what it is. But we have nosocomial infections, and we have iatrogenic infections. Now, both of these infections are from a healthcare facility. A nosocomial infection is an infection that you get if you go to the hospital. You go in there with something and you come out with something different. So This would appear shortly after admission, within 14 days. An iatrogenic infection is caused as the result of a direct medical treatment, like a surgery or something